I've got some coffee and I am ready to go, so hopefully you are also ready to go. So in this little mini lecture, we are going to keep moving with the female reproductive system, so we're going to go through the uterine tubes and the uterus and see how far we get. So the uterine tubes you may also again be familiar with as the fallopian tubes. They're also sometimes called the oviduct. We use uterine tube in this class because it gives us the best definition of what's happening. It is a tube that comes off the uterus that is going to be sort of our transport for an egg from an ovary to the uterus. When we look at the structure of the uterine tube, what we see is that we have these longitudinal ridges. So you can see those in here, nice long ridges running along the length of the uterine tube. In the uterine tube, we also have ciliated cells. Ciliated cells are these are motile cilia. So we have sort of those hair-like projections, and because they're motile, that means that they beat. So they move, or sort of the egg is going to come out of the ovary, hopefully land in this uterine tube, and then the cilia are going to beat and move that little egg down the uterine tube and towards the uterus. Remember when we were talking about gametes that we said the female egg, or the female gamete, is going to be really big and nutrient rich, but it is not motile. So to get even from the ovary here into the uterus for implantation, it's going to need help. And one of the ways that we help it along is by giving it these sort of transverse ridges to guide it down the uterine tube, and also to have ciliated cells in this location with those cilia moving or beating and basically wiggling this little egg down that uterine tube and towards the uterus. We do divide the uterine tube into 4 different segments. Okay, so the segments are going to be the infundibulum, the fembrae, ampulla, and isthmus. So let's start. This is not the order that they occur in, so let's look at this image and sort of start at this edge where we have sort of this fringe. Those fringy pieces are called the fembrae. So those fembrae are going to help us catch an egg that's been ovulated. When ovulation is about to occur, these fembrae sort of swell and cup this ovary a little bit more, and they sort of beat with the woman's heartbeat. So we get sort of this pulsing or beating of these fembrae, and that creates a little current. And so this little egg that's being ovulated gets caught in that current and gets carried into the uterine tube as opposed to falling into the pelvic cavity. So we get the fembrae down here, which are helping us catch that egg after it's been ovulated. From there, it'll move into the infundibulum. So this is the infundibulum. It's sort of this flared piece. It is at the sort of the distal end of the uterine tube. That is going to narrow into the ampulla. So this structure would be the ampulla here. It's the middle region. And then the isthmus is sort of our narrowest region that's going to connect the uterine tube to the uterus. So again, we have our fembrae. Fembrae are going to lead into this funnel shape, which is the infundibulum. The infundibulum is going to narrow into the ampulla, which is our middle region of the uterine tube. And then the ampulla is going to lead into the isthmus, which is the piece that connects the uterine tube to the uterus. So remember, in the last mini lecture we talked about the ligaments that support the ovary. We also have ligaments that support sort of the relationship between the uterine tube and the ovary, and so I did mention this one. This is what's called the mesosalpinx, which is going to sort of enfold the uterine tube and again keep its relationship to the ovary as well as to the uterus intact. So we have sort of thin tubes here. We don't want them to get disoriented or not located in the right places. So we keep them in their locations with the help of these ligaments. Moving into the uterus next, this is going to be sort of the next stop for a gamete. So a gamete comes out of the ovary into the uterine tube, and then as it passes through the uterine tube, it's going to enter into the uterus. The uterus is going to have many functions. So this is going to be the site of implantation. This is going to be the site where a fetus is going to develop. It's going to provide warmth, protection, nutrients, and then again at the end it is going to expel or result in the birth of that fetus. What we have is sort of this pear-shaped muscular chamber that actually tilts anteriorly or forward over the urinary bladder. So here is the pubic symphysis. Just behind that we have our urinary bladder. We can see directly posterior to the urinary bladder we have the vaginal canal, which actually runs posteriorly. So if we draw a line up the vaginal canal, it's going to hit in our sacrum area, so it points towards the back of the body. The uterus, on the other hand, if we draw a line sort of down its midpoint, is going to point almost towards the belly button of the female. So we are looking at an anteriorly pointing structure. We can divide the uterus into three regions. We have the fundus, the body, and the cervix. The fundus is our dome, or this top piece. We saw another fundus when we talked about the stomach, and it's the same structure here. We have sort of this domed top piece. The body is a majority of what we have. It's this mid-region. And then the cervix is going to be the cylindrical structure towards the inferior end of the uterus. The cervix is going to extend down into the vaginal canal. So we can see when we look at the vaginal canal, we can note that it actually comes up on either side of the uterus here. The piece of the uterus that extends into the vaginal canal is the cervix. So the cervix is sort of this really narrow opening that leads into the uterus. So here's another view of the uterus. The uterus, as an organ, does have a lumen. The lumen is kind of interesting. So that's this sort of triangular-like structure that is the open region of the uterus. It has two corners on the upper portion that are going to lead out to the uterine tubes, and then a single lower apex, which is going to lead out the cervix and into the urinary canal. Vaginal canal, sorry. So we have an internal os and then an external os. Those are sort of the marking points of the start of the cervix. So the internal os would be the opening from the cervical canal into the uterus, and the external os is going to be the opening of the cervix into the vaginal canal. In a woman who is not pregnant and who has never been pregnant, the lumen is what we consider potential space. And so the walls of the uterus in that woman would be sort of pressed, or in that female would be pressed together, so that there's virtually or literally no space inside the uterus. Once a female is pregnant or has been pregnant, that opening is more defined, so we can better see the lumen. You can actually look at a body of a deceased female and look at the uterus and usually determine if they have ever been pregnant or not, based on how the uterus looks. And so that's simply because once a woman has been pregnant and carried a fetus to term, the uterus is quite stretched out. And it does go back to mostly what it was like pre-pregnancy, but not quite as tightened down, so that lumen is a little bit more obvious in women who have been pregnant before. So just looking at the cervix a little bit more, there are glands that are associated with the cervix. So those are cervical glands that primarily secrete mucus. That mucus does a few things. One of the things that it's going to do is help prevent any microorganisms from entering from the vaginal canal into the uterus. We don't want is bacteria and pathogens inside of the uterus to cause an infection. So blocking the cervix area with a mucus is going to help prevent that from happening. Around the time of ovulation, that mucus is going to get thinner and slicker. And so that is going to actually help sperm move from where they're deposited in the vaginal canal into the uterus. So that gives them sort of a, it's not like super thick, sticky mucus anymore. It's more like egg white consistency, and so that serves as like a little help for the sperm to get up through that cervix and into the uterus, because fertilization is actually going to take place down here in the distal third of the uterine tube. So the sperm has to get all the way from where it's deposited in the vaginal canal, through the cervix, up through the uterus, out the uterine tube, and then it'll meet an egg sort of down in this region. Like we've already seen a couple of times before, we do have a number of uterine ligaments that are going to help secure the uterus in place, so to keep it from moving in the body at all, and also to support it during pregnancy. So during pregnancy, the uterus is going to enlarge dramatically. It is going to go all the way up potentially to the diaphragm. And so to make sure that it doesn't get damaged or twisted or turned or lay too far forward or too far back during pregnancy, we have a bunch of ligaments that are going to help support it. So parts of the broad ligament, which is that bat wing-like structure, are going to help support the uterus. Sorry, I'm getting my, gotta switch hands. Okay, so over here we have this bat wing. We have two different regions, and so we have the mesosalpinx, which is our superior region, and then down here we are going to have the mesometrium as the lower piece. Both of those are going to help support the uterus. You can see that they both connect to the uterus at some point. We also have lateral ligaments that come off of the cervix. Those are called the cardinal ligaments. So down here, they're going to come off from the lower region of the uterus. They are going to help support the cervical area and support part of the vagina as it extends towards the pelvic wall. So we're anchoring this lower part of the female reproductive system to the pelvic wall. We have uterosacral ligaments here. They are actually attached to the sacrum. So this is going to the lateral edge of the pelvic wall. This is going towards the back. I know the orientation is a little bit hard to see here, but this is going towards the back to attach to that sacral area. And then we have the round ligaments. The round ligaments were previously gubernaculum. Okay, so remember that gubernaculum, that's going to help pull the female reproductive structures into place, become ligaments after maturity. The ligaments here are the round ligaments, and they are going to terminate in the labia majora. So they come off the anterior surface of the uterus, down through the inguinal canal of the female and into the labia majora. So again, just holding everything in place. Okay, so I am going to stop here and come back to define the uterine wall, otherwise this lecture is going to get a little unwieldy. And so I will be back to talk to you about the different layers of the uterine wall and their functions in a few minutes.